think sometimes people, because of the way that movies and Hollywood have sort of weirdly sanitized what they do, we don't quite recognize that the vast majority of these killings are about sexual compulsion and torture and control.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest is author Caroline Fraser. In 2018, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Prairie Fires, a biography about Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of the Little House on the Prairie children's book series. She is out with a new book about a very different topic. It's called Murderland: Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. It explores the question of why so many serial killers, from the Green River Killer to the so-called I-5 killer to, of course, Ted Bundy, not only appeared during the same period of the 20th century, from the 1970s through the 1990s, but seem to be concentrated in the Pacific Northwest. There's a long-standing theory called the lead crime hypothesis, which posits that violent crime and violent antisocial behavior in general peaked in the 1980s, alongside the coming of age of a generation exposed to lead poisoning during infancy by leaded gasoline, paint, and other industrial emissions. Caroline takes that theory and draws a map of 3 decades of murder, making connections that law enforcement at the time was often totally unable to make, and weaving in her own childhood experiences growing up in the Seattle area. It's a long way from Little House on the Prairie, yet Murderland is infused by many of the same ecological concerns that animated Prairie Fires. This is a great conversation with an extraordinary author, and I'm delighted to bring it to you. So here's Caroline Fraser. Caroline Fraser, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Your new book is Murderland. I think of it as maybe like a cartography of American violent crime and sociopathy through the later part of the 20th century. I'm trying to figure out the best way to talk about this. There's the scope is so wide. You've put your finger on and laid out in great detail something that I was maybe subconsciously aware of, but never attached like actual data to. And that is that in the 1970s and into the 80s, there seemed to be a lot of serial killers around. So if nothing else, this book confirmed that I wasn't just imagining that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that there's so much talk now about crime and so much kind of hysteria generally around the topic that's ginned up by politicians and so forth, that we lose sight of the fact that the worst period for violent crime in this country is the 1970s and 80s and into the early 90s. And then it really fell off. And the number of serial killers matches that as well. You know, the 70s and 80s were what they call the golden age of serial killers. And I think a lot of us sort of think they were kind of invented or something.
Yes.
And just remained at a steady state. But that's not true.
I know. I guess I was a child in the 1970s, so I guess I always thought it was sort of a function of like childhood myth making, the same way we were obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle and quicksand. You know what I mean? And I guess I always like thought, oh, well, I guess serial killers, we were just, you know, it was just kind of like a thing to say. It was like a meme before there were memes. You know what I mean? But yeah, we should say the subtitle of Murderland is Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. And you pretty much narrow down this time from the beginning of the 70s, into maybe the middle of the 90s? Like what is really the window of time in your mind?
Well, the window of time is, corresponds to the release of and the use of leaded gas in this country as well. And that was removed, officially in 1986 and is fully out of the economic system by the early 90s. And so that's when you start to see a decline in the number of numbers related to violent crime, particularly, and in terms of serial killers. So that's what led to this development of what they call the lead crime hypothesis, that there may be a connection between the rise of lead in our atmosphere and the rise of violent crime.
Okay, and lead, we should say, was banned from use in household paint, for instance, in 1978. The phase out of leaded gasoline began in the 1970s. It's, again, like I remember, I don't know how old you are, but I remember kind of like being at the gas pump in maybe the 1980s, and like unleaded gas was kind of like a novelty. Like if you had a new car, if you had a new car, you had to use unleaded gas. It was like a status symbol almost.
Yeah. It's just a crazy thing to think about now. The fact that, leaded gas has been around since the 1920s, but of course in the 1920s, not that many people had cars or commuted. It was a completely different social system. And so after World War II, you see this incredible rise in the number of people who own cars and who are commuting, and also an incredible rise in the use of leaded fuel. And so this means that virtually everybody born, between 1950 and 1980 was exposed to leaded gas. It wasn't just, poor neighborhoods or wealthy neighborhoods. It was everybody. But of course, particularly people who lived closer to highways or areas where there was a lot of traffic. So of course, it ended up affecting, as such things inevitably do, poorer neighborhoods, people of color, etc. So as a social phenomenon, it's almost unimaginable, that the people who developed this fuel and set it loose into the world were essentially just poisoning generations of people.
And you highlight the Pacific Northwest. Again, this is something I never really articulated in my mind. It seems like a disproportionate number of serial killers come from that part of the country. You also come from that part of the country. So why was there more of this kind of manufacturing going on there? You talk about the smelter, the phenomenon of the smelter. So before we go any further, define smelter and explain what that means.
Yeah, so a smelter is an industrial plant that took in the fruits of mining in the form of rocks, essentially, ores, which were full of metals. And to be very simplistic about it, the smelter would burn these rocks to take out and separate the metals. And early, on in the 1880s, when a lot of these plants got going, including the one in Tacoma that I talk quite a bit about, and the one in El Paso, that smelter was originally a lead smelter. It changed to copper, but what you find when you look at the composition of the ores that they were smelting is that these rocks contained all kinds of different metals. They contained valuable metals like silver and gold. They also contained a lot of kind of waste stuff or things like arsenic. And so the smelter that grew up in what became Tacoma was originally lead, then it changed to copper, but through its gigantic smokestack, it was emitting large quantities of lead particulates and arsenic in a populated area. And this became, of course, a problem
Right.
because it was essentially, poisoning people. And this was known. I mean, a lot of farmers began to have problems with their crops. People would hang out their washing on the line. It would develop these bizarre, stains and kind of burns from arsenic. There were respiratory problems for children and people who lived near the smokestack. But the jobs were always considered more important than essentially the health of the community. So that smelter in Tacoma became one of the most polluting, I think, in the country. But the company that owned it, ASARCO, which is American Smelting and Refining Company, owned by the Guggenheim family, had smelters all over the West. In Utah, in Texas, they had a huge smokestack in El Paso, which is right on the border with Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. And so the plumes of pollution, lead pollution, that were created by these smokestacks that were sending all the lead into the air from smelters, doubtless contributed to, an atmosphere that's full of lead from leaded gas already. But then I think in communities like Tacoma, and perhaps throughout the Pacific Northwest, you start to see a real sharp rise in violent crime in the 70s and 80s.
Okay. And yeah, that was a connection that I was not aware of. We should also say that as going back many, many decades, people in Tacoma and the Pacific Northwest would talk about the aroma of Tacoma. It never had a good reputation.
No, and a lot of
city.
the aroma, to be fair, came from a pulp mill, as such aromas often do. But when you look at the history of industrialization in Tacoma, it was so incredible. I mean, there were, I think something like 25 or more heavy, plant industry plants associated with heavy industry on Commencement Bay in Puget Sound. And that contributed enormously to the pollution in the sound.
Okay, so I want to talk about this serial killer connection and why you decided to take on this project, because we should say you did not come up with this connection. I mean, this is longstanding. This has been a theory. And your previous book, for which you won the Pulitzer Prize, was about Laura Ingalls Wilder. Very, very different topic. She was not a serial killer, as far as I know. But before we get to that, you grew up in the Seattle area. Tell us about your relationship to this region and why you wanted to take on this particular aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that for a number of years there were a few experiences and anecdotes kind of rolling around in my head, for lack of a better word. There were things that happened in the 70s that including, when I was 8 years old, a man who lived down the street from me blew up his house in 1969, I think it was. And he did it with his family. His family was there and could have been killed. He had 4 daughters, and his wife and daughters could have been killed. Fortunately, they were not. They managed to escape. And in the aftermath of, in the moments after blowing up the house, he shot himself in the head. And when that happened, I think it made a big impression on me.
How old were you?
I was 8. And I think part of the impression came from the fact that nobody wanted to talk about it. It afterwards, I mean, there was an article in the local paper, and that was it. I mean, there was no more coverage of it. There was no explanation of it. And so somehow that kind of normalized that behavior in my mind. And I think with the kind of childish, logic that you have at that age, I kind of thought, ooh, this is what can happen if men get really angry. This is what dads do, if they get mad or mad enough. And so that, that experience was something I kind of wondered about for years. Like, what was that, and why was there so much crazy stuff happening? Because I do remember the weekend of Lake Sammamish when somebody named Ted, nobody knew who he was then, approached a number of women during a very, crowded, hot weekend afternoon, and two women disappeared from the beach that day. And for months, nobody knew where they were, what had happened to them. There were accounts of people who'd been there who said that this guy who called himself Ted was approaching women and asking them to help him. And so, I remember that. I remember the posters of the police composites that were stapled to telephone poles, afterwards. And I think that all of that became part of, my experience of the fact that the Pacific Northwest was, whether it's an urban legend or not, kind of painted as this place where there was a lot of inexplicable violent crime. And I think the genesis of my wanting to write about this was trying to figure that out, trying to figure, what is this true? Was it just a legend? And just kind of explore the history behind that.
And your father also had a lot of anger issues. He was somebody you were afraid of in the household.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I included some of the, descriptions about him and his behavior as part of, the spectrum of male, behavior at the time. I think it's easy now to forget what a big deal kind of domestic violence was at the time, because nobody talked about it then. Nobody kind of, it was just beginning to be recognized, I think, as a phenomenon that affected a lot of women's lives, and but was just at the time it was just sort of normal. And so I wanted to give a sense of, what even normal men, so-called normal men, were capable of, and what that behavior might include, which in my father's case was, sometimes he would fly into a rage, and, like one time he got really mad and destroyed the lawnmower, and sort of terrorized my sister while he was doing this. And so it's not just to kind of bring up, family history, but to show how different life was in a way then. I mean, obviously domestic violence is still a huge, huge issue, and we're only starting, I think, to get a handle on it, in terms of how to deal with it, how to protect women who have experience of this. But it's always been there, of course. So.
And it was obviously around before the 70s, well before, but are you suggesting that this sort of kind of the effects of this kind of chemical poisoning in the atmosphere was exacerbating it to a degree that was noteworthy?
I don't think I'm drawing a direct line in terms of that. I think what I wanted to do in this book was to paint a kind of picture of the era, and give a sort of subjective sense of what it was like to be alive then, of what it was like to be a girl in the 1970s, that this stuff was happening and it affected people, but nobody was really talking about it or explaining it, or, there just wasn't really even a sense of what is, the term serial killer doesn't really come into use until, kind of midway through the 70s and early 80s. And
is that
so,
right?
yeah, I mean, that's,
I always think of like In Cold Blood. I think of that era,
sure.
Truman Capote kind of stuff. But I guess, yeah. So you're saying the term serial killer really didn't come up until the 70s.
Not in a really organized way. I think the term was invented by an FBI guy who subsequently wrote about, the FBI profiling department, their program. And that's how it kind of came into use. But for example, when, Ted Bundy when they were investigating, trying to figure out who is this guy named Ted, who seems to be associated with the disappearance of so many women, the detective who was in charge of that investigation, he'd never been in charge of anything that even looked like that. He didn't, I don't think they were even using the term serial killer for Ted Bundy at first. So the whole phenomenon was new. It was, people could scarcely even believe, what was happening in terms of, all these victims being seized from different places that were, far distant from each other, different states, different jurisdictions.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, there are so many moments in the book where you make the point, like, something that seems like a very obvious connection to us now. Law enforcement just didn't make the connection. It's like you've got like a pair of women's underwear found over here and a similar pair found over here. And it's like, oh, well, it must be a coincidence. And I guess you're right. It's such a narrative convention in our minds now. I mean, we're inundated with crime shows and procedurals, and it's always about these connections, right? And so the idea that would have been novel is hard to imagine.
Yeah, and just the inexperience of many of the detectives who got pulled into these investigations is quite striking.
That is fascinating. So you trace the trajectories of a number of prominent serial killers. There's the Green River Killer, who's Gary Ridgway, the I-5 Killer, who's Randall Woodfield. He was from Oregon. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, of course, is from El Paso.
Yeah.
Hillside Stranglers were in California. And so, you go into details about their childhoods. They all had these just like absolutely miserable, wretched, often, quite illness ravaged or, just injuries, terrible family dysfunction, but also like a lot of physical discomfort and disease. And, in almost every case, you're able to say like, there is this toxic plant in pretty close proximity. I mean, let's actually get away from the Pacific Northwest for a second and talk about Richard Ramirez, because he had like this particularly horrible childhood and these siblings who were all very sick, and he's in El Paso. Talk about him.
Yeah, I mean, it was very, very early on when I started looking at the Pacific Northwest people and learned about the smelter. I thought, well, how many times could this have happened? And so I immediately saw that Asarco owned another huge smelter in El Paso. And I thought, well, there's no, serial killer that's associated with El Paso, I don't think. So I Google it and a few minutes later discover that that Richard Ramirez is born and grows up in El Paso and is exposed to the very significant lead poisoning and the smokestack that's basically like maybe 5 miles from where he was living. And that all of that pollution also spread south of the border as well. And if you know anything about the history of Ciudad Juarez, it's associated with what's now termed the femicides, the hundreds of homicides of women. And the fact that they think that maybe, 3 or 4 serial killers were at work in the 90s in Juarez. So to me, that was kind of a real light bulb moment where I thought, wow, if you can find these examples, what more can you find if you actually look? And I wasn't writing an encyclopedia of these guys, but indeed, I think you can find a lot of connections. Obviously, I'm doing something that, might be criticized as cherry picking because I'm using examples that are pretty clear, like Bundy and Ridgeway and Ramirez, and not talking so much about examples that might not have a connection. But when you think about the fact that, for decades, many Americans, I think most Americans lived within 10 miles of a smelter. There were that many smelters
across
in the US.
America.
Yes.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. And especially in big cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, the capital of smelters, as
Right.
it was once called, New York City, that whole corridor of Louisiana, that goes down into New Orleans, which is now known as Cancer Alley for good reason. So, during World War II, and many of these smelters predate World War II, but I think that the war was a huge, huge intensifier of all this pollution because obviously we needed metals, we needed lead, copper, and so these things were going full blast and polluting all the neighborhoods that were nearby.
Okay, but does this not throw a wrench in your theory? If the smelters are all over the place, why don't we see as many serial killers from like Vermont and New Hampshire and that nice leafy New England locales? Or do we?
Well, I mean, Vermont, I don't know the smelter quotient of Vermont, and
Right.
I actually would be surprised that if they had. There are places that did not have as much heavy industry as big cities. I'm talking about, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, etc. Right. So I think that you can find examples of serial killers in some of those other places. I was using the Northwest as my kind of, dramatic, locus because I grew up there. I knew it. The more I looked at the number of serial killers in that region, the more I found. So it seemed like a dramatic and useful example of this. But I think you can reproduce the results that I
Yes,
was
no,
looking
I was
at in
teasing you.
some other places.
I can't think of any notable Vermont murderers, but I'm sure I'm sure there are some. Well, so of the guys from the Pacific Northwest, who captures your imagination the most? I mean, Ted Bundy is an obvious example. I mean, he's exceptional because he's highly
Yeah.
intelligent and highly charming, and he's got a different kind of persona and presentation than a lot of these guys do. But who do you find yourself thinking the most about?
Yeah, I mean, Bundy was obvious just because there's a lot of material about him, and um, he's also been, I think, glamorized quite a bit, um, and become almost a kind of mythic figure. So I wanted to really focus on him to begin with, because I wanted to sort of really look at the real Ted Bundy and expose who he really was in a historical sense. But in terms of who I think about, I end with a couple of really horrific figures. There's one named Jack Owen Spillman, although he had many names, who killed a mother and her daughter in Wenatchee, Washington, in circumstances so horrific that I did not want even to describe them. I mean, truly terrifying. I mean, I think some of these guys are. And the figure that I end with, Israel Keyes, is another one of these very mysterious guys who we actually don't know a lot about. It's thought that he murdered 11 victims, I think, but we don't know who most of them are. The victims have not been found or identified. I mean, this was a guy who just kind of seized people, either in their own home. The one victim that led to his arrest, a young woman who worked in a little coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. He just, kind of grabbed her out of the coffee stand and, raped and murdered her. And there's something so malevolent about these guys who are motivated to commit sexual crimes. I mean, I think sometimes people, because of the way that movies and Hollywood have sort of weirdly sanitized what they do, we don't quite recognize that the vast majority of these killings are about sexual compulsion and torture and control. And wow, I mean, I just, to the extent that I now lock my doors and windows, it's because of thinking about guys like Israel Keyes. Not that actually stopped him, but
I mean, do we know what the actual sort of cognitive affliction of these guys are? I mean, obviously it's different from person to person, but I'm just trying to think of somebody like the case you just described with the mother and daughter. And I understand that you don't want to go into too much detail, although you can feel free to drop a couple of hints. I mean, is he brain damaged? Is he psychotic in a particular way that is connected to these kinds of toxins? I mean, what do we know about the sort of, chemical gestalt of these guys' brains?
We know quite a bit now, actually. I think that one of the sources that I was reliant upon is a book by this biologist named Adrian Raine, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Violence. And he looked at a lot of different ingredients that can go into causing brain damage, which can vary, from actual physical damage from beatings, or like if you've been in a terrible car accident or something like that, if you have actual physical brain damage to your frontal cortex. And if you're a man, this can affect you in ways that you might not have imagined. And Rain looked at a whole suite of heavy metals, including lead, cadmium, arsenic, etc., and looked at the different kinds of effects you see on the frontal cortex. He also did a lot of MRI scans that actually show these areas of deficit, these kind of gaps, or places where um, the organs of the parts of your brain that help control your behavior were actually damaged, or smaller than they should have been. And the effects are worse in men than they are in women. And I'm not sure that we know why that is yet, but there have been studies of this that definitely show that the male frontal cortex can be affected in ways that are lesser in women. In women, you tended to see more impulsivity, and there was a corresponding rise, for example, in teenage pregnancies, for example, that kind of track with the rise in violent crime, that shows, more impulsive risk-taking behavior, but you don't see the same rise in violence among women that you did see in men.
What do we know about Ted Bundy's background? I mean, I know a lot of people know a lot. I'm not a Ted Bundy aficionado, but just going back to him for a second, because he is sort of unusual and more is known about him. What kind of chemicals was he exposed to? What was going on with his brain?
Well, we know where he lived in Tacoma, and because of the studies on the plume that the state of Washington has done, they have actually posted maps of whole areas of Tacoma and other neighborhoods that you can look up an individual address. And so that was one of the first things I looked at was, okay, well, where did Ted live, when he was growing up, and how badly were these addresses affected by lead? And the place that he lived the longest was about 5 miles from the smelter. And we can see how much lead there was in his front yard and his backyard, and how much arsenic. And it was a significant amount. Not the highest that was ever recorded in Tacoma, but nonetheless significant. So we know he was exposed to that. In terms of other factors of his childhood, he famously was born in a foundling home, a kind of Catholic home for young, pregnant, unmarried women. He was left there for 2-3 months by his mother. So he was somebody who suffered that kind of abandonment, which I think is also very significant.
Right. And presumably they didn't, attachment, parenting or bonding was not a thing, that the nuns or whoever were there were not like picking him up consistently. And his mother was a teenager. She was very young, right? How old was she?
Well, she wasn't a teenager when she had him. She was about in her early 20s.
Oh, okay.
But yes, it was definitely a scandal within the family. There was a lot of confusion, I think, created in his mind as to who his mother actually was. He may have been told that his grandmother was his mother.
Oh, right. That his sister was, she pretended it was her little brother, right? Something like that. The mother?
Yes, that is one of the stories that emerged, was that they were telling this to other family members to hide the fact that she'd had a kid out of wedlock. how much of this he believed. I mean, he seems to have been very confused. He never knew who his father was. When his mother remarried soon after arriving in Tacoma, he seems to have thought for a while that that was his actual father. So we're talking about somebody who was, his name was changed, a couple times before he was 10 years old. And this seems to be a real pattern among serial killers is problems with the father, either not having one or not having an identifiable figure. And oddly, they seem to blame this on their mother or the women in their lives. And that I cannot explain, but that seems to be a real pattern.
Okay, well, obviously, the vast majority of people who grow up under these environmental conditions do not become serial killers or criminals. But do you know anything about like IQs or education rates or just kind of quality of life outcomes for people growing up in the region during these decades?
I don't know IQ levels for, the Pacific Northwest in this period. But I will say that some of the scientists who did the real groundbreaking work on lead and its costs and consequences did identify, I think, nationally that during that era, we all had significant, what they call, brain dysfunction that was, and a kind of loss of several IQ points. There are national studies of that. That show a real kind of loss of mental acuity, as they call it, which is a sort of terrifying thing to contemplate. That Americans as a whole, and indeed people all over the world, because leaded fuel was sold everywhere.
Right.
It was withdrawn in different countries at different times, but it became such an obvious factor in IQ and in mental health that virtually now I think every country in the world has withdrawn it from sale.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And you rightly pointed out a little bit ago that, these plants were located close to communities, that had a lot of racial minorities, that kind of thing. But it's also worth pointing out that most serial killers are white. They are white men. So here's the $500 question. Why are there so few, if any, Black, Hispanic, Asian, fill in the blank, serial killers?
Well, I think that the perception of that is constantly being revised, because there have been more Black serial killers, for example, identified in recent years. The guy who grew up in Mercer Island down the street from me was a kid who was Black, who had a lot of talk about not knowing who your father was. I mean, he was another example of that as well. But I mean, there are other figures. There's a guy who was called the Grim Sleeper in Los Angeles, who was killing women in Los Angeles, not very far from the airport, in a neighborhood that was pretty poor. He was killing women sex workers for decades. I mean, they don't even know how many people he killed, maybe in the 90s, in terms of 80 or 90 victims. So there are constantly more people being identified. I think the racial picture is getting filled out more. Nonetheless, as you say, the vast majority are white men. And I don't think we actually know, the full picture of that. But if you look at the opportunities that white men have to, in the sense of entitlement that they have,
Right.
you wonder if that plays a role in
It's
some.
their privilege. It's their
Yeah,
privilege is
yeah.
shining through. Well, although we should say Ramirez obviously was Hispanic. Were they a Hispanic family, or were they
His
sort of
family
white?
was from, his father was from Mexico. His mother
Right.
was American, but Hispanic.
And if I
Yeah.
am I remembering this correctly, that he actually did kill some men. Like he was in he killed a lot of people in Los Angeles. He was the one that was sort of caught because the people in the community kind of banded together and sort of followed him and were able to kind of corner him. I
Right.
don't know if you know the details of this. I feel unless I'm misremembering this and thinking of somebody else, but hadn't he
No.
killed? Is that correct? Is that no?
Yes, I mean, his pattern was that he began kind of as a petty thief, by breaking and entering um, was his thing. And he started doing that early, like in high school. He was breaking and entering, but he was also attacking, beginning to attack women. He attacked a woman in a hotel in El Paso. But by the time he gets to California and to Los Angeles, he's doing this thing where he, creeps around neighborhoods after dark, breaks into a house, often shoots and kills the man, then
Right.
rape the woman,
Right.
and may kill the woman as well, or may not. I mean, he was sort of um, all over the place in terms of the kinds of things he did to his victims. I mean, he was just, they in Hollywood they talk about, the modus operandi, and like, it always matches or something. With
Mm-hmm.
Richard Ramirez, it did not. I mean, he just did, he beat up people, he strangled people, he knifed them, he shot them. I mean,
Yeah.
everything that you can think of, he did. But yes, in the end, I mean, after the spree that went on for some months, um, he was identified in the newspapers, and because people in the community had seen the newspapers when he got off a bus, a huge crowd sort of developed on the street and began chasing him in
Right.
this kind of mob vigilante episode, which was really, and they probably would have beaten him to death if the cops hadn't gotten there, and took charge of him.
Wow. I want to talk about the writing of this book. I want to talk about your literary approach because you do something unusual. This is you tell this in the present tense.
Yeah.
It's like we're in the lives of these guys, and you really it's very layered. I mean, you talk about what's going on sometimes in the world politically, in the news, what's in the headlines, what's happening with these guys at this particular time, where they're going, what they're up to, and
Mhm.
often what you're doing at that time. Like you remember
Yeah.
being a little girl, 10 years old, et cetera, at the same time, however many miles away, this thing is happening. As an author, how did you come up with that approach?
I really didn't want to write an academic history of lead use in the United States. I mean, there are such books and they're great and they're full of, I consulted many of them. There are some great histories of this topic that are out there. But I think what I wanted to do was something much different and sort of, more subjective, as I've said, more impressionistic, and to give people a sense of what it was to live through these events, to live through this time, and how confusing it was, how um, kind of terrifying and confusing and bizarre, it was as a time. And so I think I was pulling various techniques from fiction, the use of the present tense, the use of what seems to be a kind of an unreliable narrator.
Mm.
There are times when the narrator of this book kind of says very judgmental things about, the engineers, and says, they're not as smart as they think they are. And, and
At the plant, you mean people on the manufacturing side, et cetera?
Yes, and there's also stuff about the floating bridge, which I talk about.
Oh,
The
yes.
bridge
Can you
that
explain this? Okay, explain this bridge in Seattle with the reversible lane. It's this
Right.
like nightmare, but I think I know what you mean, but can you explain what's
Yeah.
going on here? Because you remember driving on this bridge with your mother as a child.
Oh, yes. I mean, I grew up on an island, Mercer Island, which is a suburb of Seattle. The island is in the middle of a large lake, Lake Washington. And the first major floating bridge that was built in this country was built between Seattle and Mercer Island, and in the 1940s. And it was a time of a lot of bridge building in Washington, and they had just built also another bridge, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which was not floating, but nonetheless did fall down famously. And you can see the video if you'd like online. But, the bridge, I think I wanted to become a kind of a character in the story because it was so malevolent in various ways, and it also is an example of those things like smelters being built in the middle of a city, that were causing all kinds of accidents. The bridge was famous for accidents which were caused by bad engineering it was a floating bridge that kind of cut the lake in half. And so they put in this element, which was called the bulge, which opened, it kind of retracted into itself, and it opened to allow lake traffic to pass through the bridge. It's very hard to visualize unless you've seen it. But, this bulge was part of what was causing all these accidents because people would drive too fast and they'd just fly right off the bridge.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and that was a terrifying aspect. But the other terrifying thing was the reversible lanes, which was this system. And they had it in other cities. I think the Golden Gate Bridge might have had this for a while, where they would, open up 3 lanes into Seattle in the morning so that the heavy commuter traffic could get across. But that whole system was really screwed up, and people made mistakes, as they do, or were drunk or whatever, and they didn't see the lights. I mean, the reversible lane was communicated by these lights.
I see. Okay. So
if you weren't paying attention and didn't know, like, say, if you were from another state and this is the first time you've driven across the bridge,
I wouldn't know what to do. I'm not going to get near that. I would be completely perplexed.
So there were lots of head-on collisions in the reversible lane. So
I see.
The bridge became, for me, part of what was, in the kind of life is cheap category in the 1970s. It was something that was tolerated, and yet it terrified people. And now when you go back and look at what the people at the time were saying about it, I mean, people were pleading, with the Department of Transportation to stop using the reversible lane or to, do something about the bulge. But it never happened for decades because the whole thing was, the bridge was part of I-90. So it was a federal thing. And so the state couldn't really control what was happening there. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was, catastrophic, as you might say. So.
Yes, well, that word is increasingly applicable to so many things. Would you consider this a true crime book? I'm sure that would be a good marketing instinct to use that term because it is such a popular genre, especially with women. Women consume an enormous amount of true crime content in books and on podcasts. I don't actually consume a lot of it. Do you?
I, as a young person, read The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule because, of course, I had to know what the story of Ted Bundy was. And that was my introduction to true crime. And yes, I have read a lot of it over the years. To answer your question, I think this is and isn't a true crime book. I mean, it certainly is about the history of crime. But I actually think that the genre of true crime has been evolving over the last, 20, 25 years, in part because of Anne Rule. I mean, she was the one who
explain who she is for people who don't know her relationship. She had a special relationship to Ted.
Yeah, she was living in Seattle. She wasn't from there originally, but was living there, had tried to become a policewoman in Seattle, but she had various eye problems, I think, so she couldn't pass the test. So she starts writing for true crime magazines to support her kids, essentially. And she had friends in the police who would give her information and so forth. And she famously, as she talked about in her book, met Ted Bundy before anything was known about him, and worked with him in a rape crisis counseling office. I mean, it's so unbelievable. It's just, yeah. I mean, it's just bizarre. And
they were friends. They had a friendship, and she was an older woman. He wasn't hitting on her or anything, right? There was fairly.
She had a sort of like aunt relationship to him and would give him advice on his love life. And
oh my gosh.
His girlfriends. And of course, when he is first arrested, like many other people who knew Ted Bundy, including his family and friends, did not believe he could have done it. I mean, it was, I think she very quickly came to become more skeptical because she had that police background. But yeah, so then she goes on to have a real, that book is a bestseller, and she goes on to write many more true crime books, and is really one of the first people to spend some significant time and effort on the victims, to try and flesh out who the victims are in some of these cases. And that, I think, has now become kind of more of the standard of true crime. So I think true crime has evolved, has become more historical in nature, that it's not just the really salacious or lurid things that we used to think about in terms of the true crime magazines. Obviously, that's still a part of it. And I think the salaciousness has kind of migrated to television coverage. So that some of the stuff that you see on television is very much organized around this sensationalistic approach. But books, I think, have gotten more, there are a lot more books about kind of the history of these cases. And when you think about it, crime is part of our history. Violent crime is an important historical element of any society, and how we understand it, how we tell the history of it is, I think, quite important.
Why do you think women are so into true crime?
I think, that there are a number of polls now that indicate that women are drawn to it in part because they want to know how to defend themselves. They want to know how to control their own situation, in the sense that, I don't want this to happen to me, so what can I learn from these cases? I think that's a very emotional kind of response. And people are starting to write now about the the fact that while very few women have encountered a serial killer, many more women have had some experience of domestic violence. And that kind of violence is something that may, just by virtue of kind of extrapolating, if you're somebody who's had a bad experience with a stalker or a boyfriend who threatened you, this is some way of, I think true crime gives women a feeling almost of control of their experience. Like, what can I learn about this? How can I behave differently? How can I react differently? And whether it's a good way of trying to learn about it or not, that's debatable. But I think it illustrates how many women have some experience of fear in their lives. I mean, how many women have been afraid walking home at night, in a city? How many women have looked over their shoulder, to
of
see if
course.
somebody's following them? Most women have had that experience. So
Yeah.
I think this is a sort of way of kind of learning about the problem.
Yeah. And I guess I'm listening to you talk. I'm thinking, I guess it also provides a vocabulary for certain kinds of emotional manipulations. I mean, just, even if you're worried about somebody's behavior online, I mean, this is a whole other subject, but I mean, so much stalking now takes place, not even in real life, but many of the same pathologies are in play, and just sort of being aware of what to look out for is very necessary to get through life. Well, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but I wanted to actually just talk for a few minutes about your last book, Prairie Fires. I'm going to hold it up. I happen to have it on my desk. The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. You won a Pulitzer for this book, and I was struck by the role of possibly your own environmentalism in both of these books. Obviously the book we've just been talking about is about, these mines and the smelters and the chemicals. A lot of what was going on with the homesteaders and the pioneers like the Ingalls family was destroying the earth that they were on and causing the Dust Bowl. So are you like a big environmentalist? Do you think about these things a lot? I know you said that you had consulted on academic books about lead poisoning, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually a kind of little hidden direct link between Prairie Fires and Murderland, which I can tell you about. I mean, in terms of Prairie Fires, though, I think part of the reason I was so drawn to write that book was that I got really fascinated by the ecological history behind Wilder's life, which did involve, as you say, all these white settlers being kind of pushed out onto the Great Plains looking for land, and the things that they did to the land, kind of stripping all the native grass off and causing Dust Bowl conditions, even before the big Dust Bowl of the 1930s. To me, that was really fascinating and something I wanted to write about. And one of the kind of things that people really responded to in that book was this section where I describe the locust plague of the 1870s, when Laura Ingalls' family had all these hopes invested in their wheat crops and their little home in Minnesota. And all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, trillions of insects, part of this massive historical swarm of locusts or grasshoppers, descends upon their farm and destroys it, along with thousands of others. And that was an event that really almost ruined the family and was essentially kind of made the family homeless for a little while, and was a huge factor in where they ended up in Dakota Territory. And so as I was doing the research, some of the research for that, I'm looking at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I've discovered just in the course of doing this research that there's an area in North Dakota that kind of is very close to South Dakota where the Ingalls lived, that is called the arsenic trioxide site, which is where there was significant arsenic pollution because of the insecticides that were being used over the decades to destroy the grasshoppers. Because even though the species of grasshopper that the Ingalls had such trouble with went extinct, there were other species in the 30s, 40s, 50s particularly, that were destroying crops. And so there was a lot of, arsenic being produced in places like Tacoma, and the arsenic was being sold. It was being developed into pesticides and insecticides. And the places where those were used heavily, as in Wenatchee, where the serial killer I mentioned earlier killed a couple of women, and in the Dakotas, this stuff is all over the place. And there's a serial killer who grew up with some very severe illnesses that seem to maybe be related to exposure to these pesticides. And so I used this also in Murderland, talked a little bit about the grasshoppers and this serial killer, Jerry Brudos, who ends up in Oregon. And so that to me was kind of a link. I mean, I don't think most people will think about it, and there's no real reason to, but to me, it was a sort of part of the ecological history that is so fascinating, I think, that we just don't even realize the harm that we've done to the environment and the ways that harm can come back to bite us.
And that it's been going on for so long. I think we think of it as a contemporary phenomenon.
Yeah.
But there's a long history. Wow. Well, Caroline, it's a fascinating book. It's obviously was a huge undertaking. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for talking with me. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, it was fun. Okay. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Caroline Fraser, author of the new book, Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. What do you need to know? This is the Unspeakable Podcast, slowly being renamed the Unspeakeasy Podcast. We will get there eventually. If you are not yet a paying subscriber, you're going to want to become one, not only because you get to hear the entirety of this podcast every week. Sometimes it's paywalled, sometimes it's not. But you get all kinds of perks, including the opportunity to join the book club for my new book, The Catastrophe Hour. We are meeting every Wednesday, 14 consecutive Wednesdays, to talk about an essay from that book. There are 14 essays there, so we're meeting for 14 weeks. We meet on Zoom, and this is available to paying subscribers who pay at the annual level. So go to theunspeakablepodcast.com or meghandaum.substack.com. That will take you to the same place to find out how to join us there. And of course, tickets are now on sale for our Unspeakeasy co-ed extra super duper on steroids, bigger and better than ever retreat in New York City this October 11th and 12th. We have so many guest speakers: John McWhorter, Carol Hooven, Selin Davis, Mike Pesca, Peter Moskos. I could go on and on. Go to the Unspeakable, you can go to the Unspeakable Podcast to find out about that. But you can also go to the Unspeakeasy/retreats and find out how to sign up for that retreat. Space is limited, as always. I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.